Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. 深度聆听.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
Yeah, and this thing about listening that I've been realizing, Oscar, and thinking about is it seems like it's much like anything else, that it's a muscle that needs to get flexed, and if it doesn't, it's an easy thing to get out of habit from. And I have to say that I remember saying goodbye to my mother, and she said, if you can find a phone, call your mother. And I said, I will. And she said, but if for some reason I never see you again, well done. And I share that because my mother was able to listen to who I was in the world and let me be that. And not say, you can't possibly go, who could you help? You're only 24, you'll get hurt. A list of things. But she paid attention to who I was and said, go. And that's a form of listening that's rooted in respect that, has really made the life I have possible. And I keep asking until I get a sense of this person's motivations and what's really there and why this. And they're great stories when you ask enough questions and really listen for someone's deep story. I think that less anxiety makes you a better listener. And I changed my style of how I had been taught how to fundraise. That I didn't talk at someone or pitch them. Because people will say, well, fundraising is really just sales. Sure. I mean, it can be. And I'm sure if you make a good pitch with a good deck to someone and they're inspired enough, they'll write you a check. But I'm looking to say, what's our actual goal here? And our end goal is to not fund a budget. It's to attempt to fulfill missions that create social change. And how do you know if you can do that with someone unless you've discovered who they are?
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening.
In this episode of Deep Listening, we truly understand what it is to make an impact beyond words. We meet Kathy LeMay, somebody who's brought about significant change in the world through her work with charities, non-for-profits, and partnering with philanthropists. See, Kathy's been into war zones, Kathy's been fundraising and turned the industry on its head. An industry defined by pitching and asking for money, Kathy describes the impact of radical listening and how listening and not speaking helps her to raise over $175 million for the causes that she represents. Listen out as she tells the story of her time in Bosnia and meeting a man in a wheelchair and calmly and simply just listening to him. Listen to the story of Linda, an early influence in her charitable life, and how Linda helped her to understand that listening for meaning and not just the words is the way to make an impact. Let's listen to Kathy.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
What's your favourite story that brings that meaning to life?
I've been thinking about that because it's my stepfather. And I watched, he was an AA counselor, and people used to come to our door at interesting hours of the night who were really struggling. And you'd kind of hear this pounding on the door, and Rick would get up and let them in. And, suddenly there was a pot of coffee being made, and someone just sitting and saying everything that is going on in their life and happening to Rick. And realizing, I thought, isn't he going to respond? Isn't he going to offer to help? Isn't he going to offer to fix it? Is he going to say they can stay here? And thinking, no, he's just listening. And realizing these people would leave kind of hugging him and crying and thanking him. Thank God you were here. Thanks for the conversation. And I was really struck by people saying the word conversation when Rick hadn't spoken a word. So I just wanted to kind of give credit to that because I witnessed Rick really listening to people and not fixing it, but just by showing up, that there was a transformation that happened. And I would say, for me, the most compelling story was when I went to Bosnia in the middle of the war when I was 24. So that was 1994. And I went because I had read about, in Time and Newsweek, about the rape genocide camps and could not quite believe it. This was happening at the place that had the Olympics not so many years earlier. And I had a hard time imagining that this was happening to women in kind of modern day when I was in my 20s. Not something I read about, but my generation's kind of very first big written about tragedy. Rwanda would happen shortly after that. And so I flew there, and I ended up going by myself. So the person I was going to go with couldn't make it. And there were no cell phones at the time and no social media. I think a couple of people had giant shoe-sized phones, but outside of that, what we have today wasn't there. And I have to say that I remember saying goodbye to my mother, and she said, if you can find a phone, call your mother. And I said, I will. And she said, but if for some reason I never see you again, well done. And I share that because my mother was able to listen to who I was in the world and let me be that. And not say, you can't possibly go, who could you help? You're only 24, you'll get hurt. A list of things. But she paid attention to who I was and said, go. And that's a form of listening that's rooted in respect that, has really made the life I have possible. So I'll shorten it to say that I went there, that I was there by myself for a few weeks. I hired a translator who was remarkable, who allowed me to do what I still think is maybe some of my best social change work of my life. And in today's version of philanthropy, it would be, well, what were the outcomes of your trip? How many people did you help? What did you do while you were there? And it would be that which we could quantify. And what I realize now about that trip that made it, for me, powerful, and my hope is that made it meaningful for the people I met, is what I did most of the time for the time I was there is that I listened. And through my absolutely wonderful translator, who had, was just so gracious and translated everything being said to me, I sat across from people who had lost limbs, who had lost children. I met women who had walked out of rape genocide camps and sat there as close as I could to them, holding their hands, them grabbing onto my wrist and telling me every single thing that had happened to them. And it was a fascinating thing to just be witnessing people's experience and taking it in. And I couldn't fix it, and I couldn't change it, and I couldn't end the war. I couldn't, I was this kid. But I remember in particular this one man who was in a wheelchair, and it was such this rickety donated wheelchair, and he had lost from his knee down both his legs, and he lifted his shirt up as just as high as he could lift it and showed me this stab wound, and it wasn't healed well, and was telling me about what was done to him and crying. And I'm holding his hand while he's showing me this, and he's crying, and I'm crying with him. And at the end, he said this to the translator. He said, "It's so nice to share this story with you, and you don't have one to match it." And I have to say, Oscar, that moment has stayed with me my whole life, that I did not have that story to match. That did not happen to me. I have never had to live through a war like that. And how much people needed to be seen for what they had gone through and be known for that. And for me to have recognized the courage that he was still alive. And I did. And I came home and ended up raising a whole bunch of money as a volunteer for the folks there. But much like you said about the donor who gives the check, the money is the outcome of the passion. And it wasn't that hard to raise it because I had stories and because I cared. But I had stories because I listened. And I remember my stepdad listening to the people struggling with alcoholism, and I got to go and listen to people who just personified courage to me, and I could not believe their ability to endure what they were enduring. All of the people, and very especially the women and children, that was extraordinary to me. And there's not a person alive who doesn't have a backstory. Every single one of us has a story different than what we appear to be. The woman with the fur coat of the Four Seasons had a story. I have one. You have one. Your wife does. Every single person. And those stories make up this world. And if we can listen for a while to someone's story, I actually do think you end up respecting someone so much more than you might have at the outset. You end up understanding where they're coming from. And I think that you become better at what you do, because your life is not just about you and what you're trying to do, but you understand other people's lived experiences. And I think my new definition of success is my capacity not to be understood first, but to seek to understand.
As we think about the audience right now, I'm thinking about Chris Grum and what she would say we need to tell the audience right now.
So Chris is just this incredible leader who really mentored me around great listening. And one thing Chris did well is she joyfully listened. People would tell stories and she was so there. She was so into it. And I remember thinking, my goodness, where does that exuberance come from? She felt lucky that people were willing to tell her a story. I think the invitation from Chris would be, you don't have to be in a certain sector to listen to people. It will enrich your life to do it. And as much as you can, resist the urge to interrupt, to correct someone, or to share a story you have like it, or to show someone a data point on where they may be incorrect. And remember the last time someone really listened to you. And I asked someone this recently, when was the last time someone really listened to you? And she could not call on it. She couldn't. She's like, no, with that, no. And she said, I don't know. And when you're really listened to, you know. And you feel differently about the person who listened to you. There's a trust that gets built. And I think that's a great thing in life if someone looks at you and says, may I get your trusted counsel? And I think that trust is built from really listening to someone and having their best interests at heart. And what Chris Grum taught me well and does so well is she believed in building a community of people that rallied behind something. And if you want a community, you have to know who's in it. And you got to take the time. So she has taught me to slow down and take the time. What it took me a bit to get is it can be really awkward to listen and not interrupt. It can sometimes feel really, really uncomfortable, and you so badly want to go, oh, no, I just have this thing. I just did a fundraising training with this wonderful group of fundraisers in Victoria, Canada, and I had them paired off with each other. And I gave them 2 questions and said, so just take some time to think about how you want to answer to that. Person A is going to ask, person B is going to respond. And I looked at person A and I said, so look at me, person A, no matter what they say, no interrupting. And they all looked at me like, I'm not going to interrupt, Kath. Reel it in. And I knew that within less than 60 seconds, the person would, and I watched people put their hand over their mouth, and then the person who was sharing was hysterically laughing. And afterwards I said, so how was that? And everyone said, oh, so hard. But it was not interrupting out of any arrogance. It was enthusiasm. Oh my goodness, I had that same experience. Oh my goodness, I can't wait to share. And what I say to people is, I promise you'll get your turn. I promise you'll get your turn. But often if you ask someone one question, much like Oscar, you've asked me, I start answering, and it's not until I'm a few minutes in that I think of something else that I want to share, that I hope that just emerged in me that I thought, I haven't thought about that in forever. There's unbelievably great gems inside people. If you can just pinch your wrist or something to prevent you from interrupting in the first 2 minutes, it won't feel that awkward to really deeply listen to someone. And most people will say, if they have a death of a loved one or a really bad challenge at work or something going on that's a big deal, and you listen, you don't have to fix it or have a solution. Most people will say to you later on, thanks so much for listening. That helped a lot. And so knowing there's nothing I can fix in people's lives, and that's not my job, but what I can do is radically listen and kind of in that maybe build that community that we all say we kind of need to get us through this world.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
깊은 듣기.
Deep listening.
Kathy, I'm intrigued what prompted you to write 2018 as a year of listening for everybody.
In my country right now, none of us are listening to each other. All you have to do is talk, take any glance at any form of media. And it seems to be the winner is the one who drowns out the other person, even if you do not have and are not making a case that's reasonable or helpful or thoughtful. If you can drown someone out, and it's not even you're more clever. It's if you're louder or more boisterous or more aggressive. And so it would almost seem I'm responding to that landscape. The truth is I'm actually responding to me. That for a long time, I was an astute and excellent listener. And I started to notice that I was losing that quality. And I wondered what was going on for me, but I would think about it for a moment, question it and say, no, it's fine. I have a lot of objectives I have to achieve, a lot of goals. I have this company I've built. I have things I have to accomplish, and I have to go. And I kind of drank that Kool-Aid that the more successful you got, the more visible you should be and the more you should be talking. But there is so much about, well, what's your brand and what are you saying out there and how much are people seeing you? And I started to get sucked in to that vortex of this is who I'm supposed to become if I'm going to make it. If in fact me getting quieter and listening more means I will not continue to have success, then that may be a club I want to revisit and see, do I actually want to join it? I noticed myself interrupting people that I cared about, not because I didn't think what they were saying was important, but because my own anxiety about needing to move forward my agenda took over. And there just was a moment where none of it really felt like who I am. And I thought, oh no, I think I'm playing house here. I think I'm playing at something. I think I'm trying to be something that I'm not. And I thought, I'm going to shut my trap for a little bit because everybody already knows what I think. It's not as though I'm going to say something new and grand out of nowhere. And I just sat with people and said, may I ask you some things about your world and your life and your work? And I just was smiling all the time. I know that sounds a little Pollyanna, but legitimately, it was the antidote to despair for me. it was, I can't believe how bloody thoughtful the people are that I know, and people that I necessarily wasn't sure I would have a lot in common with. I found out I had much more in common with than maybe I would have guessed. And I loved listening to people. And I somehow felt like I was going away from being successful, and then I was moving toward being wise. And I thought, I'm going to quiet down for a while and try and cultivate it. So that's what my listening has been. And I am so digging it. And interestingly, I'm getting more successful, which is not something I thought would happen.
At level 1 listening, it's about listening to yourself. And as you went through this journey of listening to yourself, what did you hear back from yourself?
It was a little uncomfortable because the first was that I realized that I've had this lifelong fear of becoming invisible, that I convinced kind of in my DNA that I am forgettable and replaceable, and needing to be present and visible at conferences, events, galas, needing to have a role in each of them where I wasn't a participant, but I was always speaking in some way, was really about trying to fill that black hole of, if I'm not seen for a year, people will forget I was here. I think that less anxiety makes you a better listener. As I've decreased the anxiety by building a community of people and not needing the success to just be mine, not again out of arrogance, but out of a sense that I had to prove to myself that I was good enough. And now that I have removed a lot of that anxiety and that old story that may have served me for a while and just stopped as I got older, I now sit with clients or prospective clients, and I don't feel the need, oh my goodness, I don't have to rush to turn them into a client, or I don't have to rush to close a gift, because it's all not on my shoulders and I'm sharing responsibility. Then I have a chance on behalf of my company to go and sit with a potential client and say, so what do you think about what we're offering? Does it seem like, does it make sense to you? Is there anything about it that jumps out as, God, Kathy, I'd really love this? Or is there something where you look and say, I want it to make sense for my life, but here's where it's not. And I can really hear that without thinking, no, I have to close this person in order to make this business goal. And I'm seeing by really 100% putting the person across from me first, that I am then creating something that actually serves their needs. And I'm sure I've done that in the past, but not as well as I'm doing it now. And I'm really, really loving it. So each time I sit down with a person, it's a little bit like Christmas for me, because I know they're about to share with me a wealth of information that's going to make my brain grow. And then I'm going to go to that with my team and say, what do we think? What this person shared, this feels like gold to me, what they just said. How can we do something with it that's valuable for a lot of people? That's great. That is anxiety-free leadership for me. And I'm not sure I would have named in the past. There was a lot of anxiety for me. I thought I was just plowing through it, and the stress was a big part of it. And now really realizing you can choose to have less stress in business leadership. And kind of what I thought it looked like until I realized, what if it wasn't so manic? And what if listening steadied and slowed it all down, and growth was healthy and normal and not big, and realizing something doesn't have to be a big name, a big wallet, a big win in order for it to be successful. And so redefining that has also helped me redefine what does success look like.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Kipun Tsitki.
Deep listening.
Is there a donor story that really stands out that highlights that impact?
This thing about listening that I've been realizing, Oscar, and thinking about is it seems like it's much like anything else, that it's a muscle that needs to get flexed, and if it doesn't, it's an easy thing to get out of habit from. So years ago, I was doing some fundraising for an international women's human rights group, and I was in my 20s, so I was new, and my friend was on a board of directors for this group I was raising money for, and she said to me, "You know what, Kathy, you've got to meet my friend Linda. She lives in New York. She's going to love this organization. She's going to love you. I think she really will make a gift toward this." And I said, "Excellent." And I get the phone number and I call, and it is the assistant to this woman who is, kind of her gatekeeper. And we have a conversation, and she realizes who I am and says, "Okay, great. We're confirming breakfast with you and Linda," was the woman's name. And she said, "So, she'll meet you this morning at this time at the Four Seasons in New York." And I'm sitting there going, "What?" Because I'd only ever heard about and read about the Four Seasons. And so I had a sense that maybe this was just a couple class levels above me. And really, I'm thinking the whole time, is there a Denny's that she wants to, because I could treat us to that. And I was nervous. I was still a kid. And this felt a bit out of my league. And I got to the Four Seasons, and I went early. And I remember really thinking, is this a nice enough outfit that I'm wearing? But I wasn't making that much money. So, not going to nice department stores and thinking, it'll just have to do. And I get to the Four Seasons, and I'm waiting, and, in comes this woman, and she is looking around in that way that, someone's looking for you. But I thought to myself, oh, no, there's no way this person can be my appointment, because this is for a women's human rights group. And this woman walking in has a big hair and a lot of makeup, a full length mink coat, and incredibly tall stiletto heels, like that thin heel. And I thought, no way. And she walks right over to me and she says, "Are you Kathy? I'm Linda." And I stood up and said, "I am. It's so nice to meet you." And my heart is just racing. And she said, "I'm so very sorry that I'm late and I kept you waiting." And I said, "No, my goodness, no, it's fine." And the waiter comes over and says, "I'm ready to show you to your table." And I froze again. And I just thought, seriously, she has her own table at the Four Seasons. And I'm thinking the whole time, don't blow it, don't blow it, don't blow it. But I can feel the swell of stress and the thinking, just tell her about the organization, do the pitch that it's the best you can do, cross your fingers and hope something comes of it. And we start walking to the table, and the nice busboy's there with us. And I'm walking just behind her, and she takes off her full-length mink coat, and without turning around, she stretched her arm out and handed it to me. And so what's coming at me is this giant mink coat. And I'm going, oh God, oh God. And Oscar, like seconds that last forever. And I am thinking, take it, Kathy, take the coat, just take the coat. And the other part of me is thinking, oh, I can't. And so in that moment, I thought, I have to talk to her. I have to tell her. And I recalled one of the many wise things that my mom said to me growing up is, just remember, you don't have your dignity if you rob someone of theirs. And so I leaned forward and I put my hand on the small of her back, which is this thing that women can just do if we have to connect with each other about something. And I said, "Oh, Linda." And she kind of turns around quickly, and I said, so I'm a huge animal rights activist, which I am. And I said, and it would be a little bit difficult to take your coat, but I'm wondering if it would be okay if I found someone to hang up both of our coats. And she just stopped And she kind of leans down, and the poor busboy, I think, is thinking, I'll take it. I'll take the coat. And he's so nervous. And when she lifts her head back up, she's got tears filled in her eyes. And I'm thinking, I'm fired. That's it. That's the end. I can't believe I said something. And she looked at me and she said, can I tell you why I was late today? And I said, yes. And she said, one, and she took her hand, starting at her head, and kind of went down her whole body and back up and said, it takes a long time to look like this, and I have my husband's reputation to uphold. And I kind of froze thinking, oh my God. And she said, and also our friend Sue told me that you're awfully smart about all of this, and I was a little intimidated to come today. And I stood there and I said, you were intimidated. I'm just so glad I didn't give you my coat, because it's being held together with duct tape right now on the inside of it. And we laughed, and the busboy took her coat, and we sat down, and she said, I'm so sorry about the coat. It's just this instinct. And I said, no, it's okay. I just didn't want us to get off on the wrong foot. I feel really excited about this work, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about it. And I said, can I, instead of pulling out a packet and talking to you about the group, can I ask you how you know Sue? And can I ask you what about being involved in this kind of work felt like I want to take the meeting with this woman I've never met? And we talked, and I listened. And my goodness, she had this life that I felt so ashamed of myself that when she walked in, I had made assumptions about her because I was wrong. And she was smart and interesting. And she told me that when she grew up in a household, she and her mother were the only females. And at dinner every night, her father and her brothers would talk about the social issues of our time. And she and her mother were not allowed to speak. And she said, I need women's groups as much, I think, as many people do. I think people think because of the resources I have, I don't need them. And she said, and I want to invest the money that I have there. So I don't want any other girl to be silenced the way that I was. And then she said, who are you? And I said, oh my goodness, like me and my life. She said, I'd like to know about you and your life. And I just told her about my life, and I hadn't ever been that open and upfront before. I had kind of hid my background or hoped my clothes didn't reveal it, or, my haircut at the $10 haircut place somehow wasn't always just screaming that I was from the lower financial classes. And I always tried to pass. My mom's from Finland. I have these high cheekbones, and I always tried to figure out how I could pass for a higher class level. And I just told her the truth about my life. And we just sat there and told each other the truth. And she listened when I spoke, and I listened when she spoke. And I thought about that story, Oscar, because at first glance, it doesn't necessarily seem like a listening story. But the first is that, and you reminded me by asking the question earlier about listening to yourself. I remember reading Gandhi as a kid and not really knowing what he meant, but he would say, if you can listen to that still small voice inside you. And I'm not sure that I 100% knew what he meant, but I think moments like that, for me, that's an interpretation of what he meant. I could have just taken the coat and then had one of those regular kind of fundraising meetings, and then later on resented her. Who does she think she is? Like all of that stuff. And I thought, but aren't I responsible for breaking that dynamic in some way? Isn't some of this finally on me? I'm a grown up. And so I first listened to me that said, if I'm going to do this authentically with people, I'm going to have to be authentic with them. And then give them a chance to tell their story to me. And so for me, listening is about also the willingness to tell your own story not just your bio or your resume, but your actual story about your life. And I think my fundraising has been based on that, is that I now don't assume that because someone can write a lot more zeros on a check than I'm able to, that they have everything worked out. I think I thought they did. And it's been an incredible learning to be in philanthropy and see people in their full humanity and not an idea I had about them.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Penne ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
If critical thinking is the ability to read between the lines and make informed decisions, Oscar Trimble clearly explains how listening between the noise can be a critical advantage. For all decision makers out there, listen up, for this is the sound of change we've been longing to hear.
Deep listening.
are.Learning.
Diepgaand luisteren.
Obratiti pažnju.
Deep listening.
We talk about listening making an impact beyond words. In the case of Linda, what do you think the big difference is in terms of what she might have donated and what she ended up actually contributing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say quite a bit, because at one point we were, having this great conversation, and I asked her what she meant about having to uphold her husband's reputation by what she looked like, and she really talked about that quite a bit. And I remember thinking at that moment, I can't recall who, but there's a poet who says, there are rooms of experience I could never enter. And I suddenly realized that there were lives and worlds that I didn't understand. And she was giving me this glimpse into her life, which was exceptional. And I was doing the same in return. And at one point, she opens her bag and pulls out a checkbook, and she said, "So how much would you like?" And I said, "Do you want to see the pamphlet and the brochures that I have some program printout?" She goes, "No, I mean, you can give them to me later, but not really. I just want to be a part of what you're doing." And I said, "Well, it's $10,000 a year for 3 to 5 years." And she said, "Great." She wrote a check for $10,000 and handed it to me. She said, "Will you not write the name of the group in the subject line for me, or the 4-2 line?" And I said, "I will indeed." And she said, "Just so you know, you could have gotten much more." And I said, "Well, are there any more checks on that checkbook?" And, we laughed quite a bit. And she said, I feel it's a gift for me to be part of this work. So you're welcome, but I also feel like I'm being given a gift here. And I changed my style of how I had been taught how to fundraise, that I didn't talk at someone or pitch them. Because people will say, well, fundraising is really just sales. Sure. I mean, it can be. And I'm sure if you make a good pitch with a good deck to someone and they're inspired enough, they'll write you a check. But I'm looking to say, what's our actual goal here? And our end goal is to not fund a budget. It's to attempt to fulfill missions that create social change. And how do you know if you can do that with someone unless you've discovered who they are? And you can help them decide, is this really the right place for them? I've turned gifts down from people who I've thought, now that I know you, I don't think you'll find a home at this organization. It's really different than what you're looking for, but here are groups I think you should pursue. Because ultimately we need the resources to go where people's hearts live. And I think that's when we see the change happening. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure what she would have given. I know she kept giving and kept giving even after I left. And I do like to think that first breakfast meeting at the Four Seasons, which at its outset was completely intimidating to me, became something other than what I expected.
How do you listen for what's unsaid during those meetings?
That's a really good question. I think because I'm sometimes listening for where people's heartbreak is. There's this thing in social change where you're expected to, I think, talk about the wins and the successes and the opportunity and the possibility but we're all, those of us who do the work, no matter what our role is, are carrying some grief and heartbreak about how some people have to endure the lives they have to endure. And I think I'm often paying attention for people's grief, because it can be a really lonely thing to feel grief-stricken about the state of the world, but feel like, well, I shouldn't burden people with that, or it's not helpful if we talk about it because we have to be in solutions and outcomes and results and possibilities. But I'm usually really hearing people's despair and overwhelm or sadness, and I'm listening for it. And sometimes it's subtle and it's quiet. It's one word that they say, or it's how someone turns their head away and doesn't look at you for a second because they're feeling it. And I often just then ask people that and say, how's your heartbreak about the state of the world these days? And I'll say to people, mine really teeters. There are times that I'm okay, and other times I feel like, oh, here comes the undertow again. I'm getting pulled. And I was just sharing with a donor the other day, there are times where I wonder if my 25 years in this field has made a difference. I'm not always sure, and I hope it has, but I have moments of thinking, what if it doesn't? And she said, oh my God, you think that? I think that all the time. And I said, you do? And she said, all the time. And I said, have you shared that with other people? And she said, no, I think I haven't, because, I make these $1 million gifts, and I think people think because I do this and because of you, these lives will be changed, and I'm giving an award at Black Tie Affairs and all of that, that I have to carry the upbeat banner. And I don't want people to feel they have to take care of me around it, or that I'm feeling discouraged about their work. I'm not. It's just a melancholy some days about the world, and did my drop in the ocean matter? And so I'm paying attention for that, because it's really, I'm quite aware how present it is in me, that you can have an achievement in social change, and you helped these children in Syria, or you were able to help folks down the street who had a house fire, or any one of these things that feels meaningful to you. And then here comes the tsunami of stories about the next terrible set of things that's happened, and you think, holy cats, is it working what I'm doing? So I'm listening for grief, because I think there's more of it in social change than maybe gets named out loud. And I think supporting each other around it, I think, gets people's leadership to the next level. My friend in corporate America said to me, we never talk about our vulnerabilities the way you all seem to in social change. She said, that's a death wish in my industry. And she said, you just are always, I'm going to make sales, I'm going to make goals, we're going to hit. You don't talk about things that feel like they're a liability. And I think for a long time I thought that my sadness that creeps up quite a bit was a liability, until I recognized that it's a strength, because it means I actually still care. And I think if you're going to be in social change, really legitimately caring kind of matters.
Deep listening.
Aktivt lyssnande.
Utechelesa ngamanda.
Geri sun.
Grandon ddyfn.
Deep listening.
For outsiders, when people make donations, they think about how much they contribute, whether that's time or money. But often there's meaning behind what they're contributing. How do you explore what it means to a donor rather than what it is?
To me, the idea of really deeply, radically listening is rooted in curiosity. That you're not looking for what the person says to tie it back to one of your goals, but that you're looking for the undiscovered country in their own mind that you haven't discovered yet. And so when I say to people, and start off with, tell me why, when you think about supporting children throughout the world, why is that important to you? When did you know that that's what mattered? And more and more people say, oh, well, I went to this event and I saw this speaker and this work where they were doing for kids and, who were living in low income situations or who had survived a war. And, they'll give me these wonderful examples. And then I'll say, yes. So a lot of people probably were at that same event in the room with you. They were also inspired, but they maybe when they went home didn't continue the work, and you took it to the next level. How come? What is it about kids that has you say? And I keep asking until I get a sense of this person's motivations and what's really there and why this. And they're great stories when you ask enough questions and really listen for someone's deep story. And I could write books about asking people 3 to 5 questions and the things that they then shared with me after. Many times that they would say, I've never shared this out loud before, or, boy, until you're asking, I'm not sure I've articulated it, or mostly what you'll hear from people is, this is a deeply personal issue for me, and here's why. If you really ask and if you really listen. And if there's a reason that people support what they support and why it's so meaningful for them. And it may sometimes be a family member had this illness, or I had traveled to that country once before 20 years ago, and now I've read this situation is unfolding. And those happen, but they're usually people's reasons for getting behind something are really deep for them and incredibly meaningful. And I'm better at my job because I've asked over and over. And I had someone ask me once, does anyone ever feel like you're intruding? I would say one time there was one person who said to me, could you may favor not ask me any more questions because I'm just feeling overwhelmed by it. And I said, absolutely. And weeks later, she wrote me an email and said, you've asked me the things that are really important, and I'm almost ready to start answering them, but not quite yet. So that one time, it wasn't the exact right approach for that person, but for the most part, I find that in my sector, the donors and philanthropists aren't used to being asked about what's on their mind and what they think and what they're aiming to achieve and why it's so important to them. They're just used to being pitched. And name one of us who can be endlessly pitched and really then know if we're living into our purpose.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Ku yingisela swinene.
Deep listening.
I love interviewing people at the top of their profession. They typically take a different path to where the rest of the industry is going. And while the rest of the charitable industry is speaking, pitching and selling, Kathy was listening deeply to what's unsaid and connecting the donor with their purpose to understand what's important to them so that Kathy could listen at the level of meaning. I love her term radical listening because there's a depth to Kathy's listening that was quite extraordinary. And I think part of that was role modeled beautifully by her stepfather Rick and her mum in the story when she farewelled her daughter to go to Bosnia into a war zone, and her stepfather who role modeled beautifully how he listened to people as an AA counsellor in the middle of the night with a cup of coffee, and these people just hugged him for listening. How could you listen a little bit more deeply? How bigger an impact could you make if you radically listen the way Kathy does? $175 million in 25 years. I think that's only the start of Kathy's journey, and I don't think it's the money that she's most proud of. It's the impact she's had for children, for women, and for men in war zones. Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Lourdes Lascelles.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words. Hi, it's Oscar again. Thanks for listening to the podcast series. We think it's the people we interview that make the biggest difference in helping the world to listen deeply. We're always on the lookout for great role models of listening. You might know them. If you do, it would be great if you'd like to introduce them to the podcast series. Simply send an email to podcast@OscarTrimboli.com. That's podcast@OscarTrimboli.com, or they can visit the website OscarTrimboli.com/podcast interview, where all the details of what's involved is listed out there. Who knows? That great listener just might be you. Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Ukulalela.
Deep listening.
Aktibong pakikinig.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.